Hey guys, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I'm Greg. In my video yesterday, I mentioned that Alice Munro is a female author I want to read, and that in her case, she's an author I want to reread, and I kind of touched on why, and I thought I would expand today into some other authors that I want to revisit for various reasons. Maybe I didn't like the book, and I wonder if my opinion has changed over time, or maybe it's a book that I really liked, and I wonder if it holds up now that I'm a little bit older than I was when I read it the first time. And with Alice Munro, I mentioned that the issue was that I read Hate Ship, Friendship, Love Ship, Courtship, Marriage, which is a collection of short stories, when it first came out. That was 2001. In 2001, I was 19 years old, and I think Hate Ship, Friendship deals with a lot of kind of grown-up things. Not that 19-year-olds aren't grown-ups, but I feel like I would probably relate to it a lot more now than I did at 19. Now that I'm older, I'm married, I have a foster child, I feel like I would actually understand the book a lot more than someone who was still a teenager. And shout out to an enthusiastic reader who recommended that I revisit Alice Munro maybe by checking out Runaway before diving back into Hate Ship, Friendship, Love Ship, Courtship, Marriage. I will probably take that advice. Thank you for that. Now, one of the big ones is actually a series that I want to revisit. It's the Harry Potter series. Now, I pulled down the Deathly Hallows because, I don't know if you can see, I have all of the books piled except for this one, and so I didn't want to dig out Sorcerer's Stone, but I want to trust me, when I say I want to revisit the whole series. And part of that is that I discovered Harry Potter when Prisoner of Azkaban was released. Originally, I wasn't going to read them. I saw them in a bookstore near my high school that I visited all the time, and I would kind of sneer at them on the bestseller list and think, well, that book is for children. I'm just here to buy my Daria tie-in book and maybe an Agatha Christie, and I'm going to go. That's kind of how I was as a teenager, which again is probably why I didn't relate to Alice Munro very well. And then I stayed over at somebody's house, and I woke up really early in the morning and could not fall back asleep, and nobody else was awake, and I was too intimidated to venture out into the house. And the only thing that there was in the room to entertain me was a copy of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And I ended up reading half of it right then and there, and ran to the store, bought the first 3 books, and loved them. And I have loved them ever since. I devoured all of the movies. I have reread every single one of the books at least once. I think this is the only one that I have reread only one time. But it's something that feels kind of identified with my personality, that I love Harry Potter so much. I had not reread any of them in a while, and I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, I decided I wanted to reread them now that I'm like fully entrenched in adulthood, and I wasn't sure I was liking it. So I kind of ran away because it felt a little scary not to like something that you've liked as much as you have for as long as you have. But I feel like I should do it because part of what I wasn't liking was that I don't know if I like the way the books define Harry as a hero. Like, he's this renegade, he's a rebel, but he's also kind of a jerk his flagrant disregard for the rules is kind of problematic. So I really want to go back and actually reread the whole series and see what I think about it now that I'm an adult. Will it still be magical fun, or will it just be problematic? I don't know. It's going to be a lot of soul-searching and questioning my soul, and maybe we can do that together. Hopefully, I'm actually thinking of doing that sometime this year if I can get my TBR and my library book backlog under control. So we'll see about that. Another book is something that I used to call one of my all-time favorite books. I went through a phase in my early 20s where I really liked what I called quirky books. Other people might call weird books. And the king of those books has always been Geek Love by Katherine Dunn. I kind of want to reread this just to see if I still like it as much as I did when I was in my early 20s. I have very fond memories of it, but there are parts of the book that, when I think about it, it's kind of like, is that problematic? Should that be problematic? And, so I feel like I need to go back to the book to actually find out where I stand on this now, and if some of the things that are in it are problematic. If you don't know, this is a cult favorite book. It's about the Benuskis. They are a family who is in the circus. Most of the children have outward physical abnormalities that make them part of the freak show. You have, let's see, there's Arturo the Aqua Boy, who has flippers for limbs and a megalomaniacal, there we go, ambition worthy of Genghis Khan, Iffy and Ellie, the Lissam Siamese twins, albino hunchback Ollie, and the outwardly normal chick whose mysterious gifts make him the family's most precious and dangerous asset. Like I said, I remember loving this book. I just kind of want to go back and see if I still do or not. So there's that one. And another book that I really loved at the time, and I think I would still love, but I want to go back because I think identity politics have changed a lot since it came out. And I want to see if it still holds up in that regard. It's Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides, which, of course, won the Pulitzer Prize. And, of course, this book follows Calliope Stefanidis. I believe the book repeatedly refers to Calliope as a hermaphrodite. I know that is not necessarily a term we use anymore now, so which is kind of why I want to go back to it. I want to see how it was handled when this book was published and how we talk about these things now. We have a lot more understanding about intersectionality and the spectrum of gender identity than we did at the time this was published. And I have a lot of people in my life who are transgender. And for the record, I know being transgender and being intersex are very different things. But I feel like it's just, on the whole, we have a lot more understanding about some of the things that Middlesex is doing. So although I love the book and I find it very interesting, I kind of want to go back and revisit, even if just to see how much better we know or understand now. Another book I talked about in the weirdest books I read of all time, I think I mentioned then that I want to reread it. It's The Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. This is a wild book. This is probably the book that launched my quirky phase of reading. It has Vonnegut's recurring character Kilgore Trout. It is wildly surreal, farcical, and basically I just want to see if it still holds my attention. So we'll see. And then there's a book that I thought I owned, but apparently I don't. It's Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I remember, again, this was in the same period as Geek Love and Breakfast of Champions. That's when I read this, and I remember really liking it. I remember it being a very funny book. It's a satire about war, and I just kind of want to revisit it and see. I think that period of my reading is something I look back on, because now whenever I've tried to go back to it, I think my reading taste has changed a little bit, so I wonder if that would impact how I feel about these books. I think I would still like this, but I want to find out for sure. That's all. Another book I read around that same time period, but it's not necessarily quirky, it's just things they carried, which I talked about in Books That Made Me Cry. Now, the reason I want to revisit this one is that it provoked such a visceral response in me that I kind of want to see if that holds up, or if it was just very particular to that point in time when I read it, or that reading experience that I had with it the first time. It's a series of stories about soldiers in Vietnam, before Vietnam, and after Vietnam, struggling to readapt to the world. And it impacted me. It was like took a sledgehammer to my heart, and I want to see if it can do that again. And then, of course, there is Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. Now, I actually liked Wolf Hall when I read it, but I remember thinking, it's kind of too long. It's a little boring in stretches. And then I read Bring Up the Bodies, which I fully loved. And so I want to go back to Wolf Hall to see if, now that I've read the second book in the planned trilogy, the third has not come out yet, if that changes my opinion of Wolf Hall. Was I a little more critical of Wolf Hall? Because I think Wolf Hall is burdened by laying out a lot of the foundation of Thomas Cromwell, and Bring Up the Bodies gets to enjoy having the foundation already established. Basically, Wolf Hall tells his story from his childhood all the way into him getting in with Henry VIII. Bring Up the Bodies is a very specific point in time. It only tells the story of Henry VIII divorcing Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, and then the fall of Anne Boleyn. And that is, of course, a fascinating period in history. It's a very interesting story to tell. It's really good. So now that I know where the story has gone, I'd like to go back to Wolf Hall and find out how I feel about it now. And finally, volumes 1 and 2 of Mouse by Art Spiegelman. I remember really liking this. Remember thinking that it was a very clever way of telling World War II story. It talks about his father, who was a survivor of concentration camps, and it talks about his survival and what it is to be the child of a survivor. One thing it does and is famous for is it represents different nationalities with different animals. Jewish people are mice, Germans are cats. That's kind of literal right there. Part of the reason I want to go back is that that sounds like an interesting idea, but some of the other ones, I don't know. I wonder if it's a little bit problematic now, because looking back, I believe French people are illustrated as frogs. So I kind of just want to go and do a little bit of an interrogation around that. I think the story is solid, but I have questions in my head about some of the representation in it. So there you go. There are some books that I would like to revisit. I don't know if this is something you have thought of, but if you have, are there any authors that you would, or books that you would like to revisit and see how your read on them has changed over time, if your opinion has changed? This is something that I wonder if other people think about. I don't know if it's just that I'm in my mid-30s now and I'm kind of looking back, and my opinion about a lot of things I read in my early 20s or my teens has changed. So I don't know if it is something that you've thought of. Let me know. Let's talk about it. And I'm going to be back. Until then, happy reading.